Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey team, Mikki here. You're listening to the 100th episode of Mikkipedia. Can you even believe it? It has almost been 2 years. Wow, I am absolutely stoked and cannot believe that I've had the opportunity to speak to some amazing people over the last 100 episodes and continue to be excited by the guests that I can bring on to Mikkipedia. Thanks so much for listening, and if you're new to Mikkipedia, how amazing. You have 100 episodes as a sort of back catalogue to go and listen to. I always appreciate your feedback and feel very privileged that you choose to listen to us each week and that you recommend us to your friends. It means the absolute world to me. So thank you so much for being here on the 100th show. Now, this week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Eric Westman. He is one of the modern day pioneers in the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet space. So we talk about Eric's introduction into the ketogenic diet via the Atkins approach, actually, that some of his patients followed, and this subsequently led to his researching and clinical trials in the ketogenic diet and publishing several trials showing its efficacy for obesity, type 2 diabetes, GERD, polycystic ovary syndrome, and more. And not only in that sort of scientific literature space, but also out in popular culture as well, where Dr. Westman, in addition to being featured in many magazines, so really popularising the low carbohydrate space, he also co-authored the more recent edition of the Atkins Diet, New Atkins, New You, with Drs. Jeff Volek and Stephen Phinney. So we talk all about this and also some of the areas where people can go wrong on a keto diet. And we discussed Dr. Westman's online platform, Adapt Your Life Academy, where he and his colleagues provide information and education to help people at the grassroots level to change their diet and improve their health outcomes. So those of you who are unfamiliar with Dr. Westman, he is, as I said, the co-founder of Adapt Your Life and Adapt Your Life Academy. He's an associate professor of medicine at Duke University Health System and director of the Duke Keto Medicine Clinic in Durham, North Carolina. He is past president of Obesity Medicine Association and a fellow of the Obesity Society. In 2010, he was named the Obesity Medicine Association's Bariatrician of the Year for his work in advancing the field of obesity medicine, as well as the society. He graduated from Stanford University, University of Wisconsin, University of Kentucky, and Duke University. He's a board certified in internal medicine and obesity medicine and has a master's degree in clinical research with over 90 peer-reviewed publications to his name. Now, before we crack into the show, if you are listening to this and it's not yet October, you still have a chance to go into win Newzest's 12-week spring reset pack worth $3,500. All you need to do is head over to Newzest, www.newzest.co.nz, and order whichever products you like. Enter the code Mikki20, that's MIKKI 20, for 20% off your order, plus an entry to win this amazing giveaway, which is a Homedics massage gun, a Garmin Fenix 6S Pro sports watch, a 3-month supply of Newzest products, 12-week nutrition coaching program online with me, 2 online personal training sessions with Darren Ellis, former guest of the show, a Pro 1000 NutriBullet blender, and a $500 Lululemon voucher. Amazing. So all you need to do before it hits October is to head over to newzest.co.nz and purchase your favourite products. Mine is, of course, good green vitality. All right, team, I hope you enjoy this 100th episode of Mikkipedia with Dr. Eric Westman. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me this morning. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you, obviously, about the low carbohydrate nutrition space, how it has changed over the years, and also about your online resources that have helped people who don't have the ability to see someone like you in person, how it's helped them sort of change what they do. I understand that you trained under one of the sort of more modern pioneers of low carb, Dr. Atkins. Can you describe your introduction to low carb for our audience and how you ended up sort of under his mentorship, if you like?
Sure. Well, so like most doctors, I didn't get much training in nutrition or even weight loss, how to help people lose weight. And this was back in, 1998. So I was, 8 years into a academic role at Duke University and doing clinical trials in smoking cessation. I learned how to do clinical trials that would be led toward FDA approval of the nicotine patch and other nicotine products, for example. But we were required to be in the clinic also taking care of patients at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in my program. And so 2 of my patients came in actually having lost over 50 pounds on their own without me doing anything. And I was very curious. I thought, what did you do? And they told me that one fellow said, all I did is eat steak and eggs. And he kind of looked me in the eye, and I was kind of shocked. He did it for shock value. But really, what they were doing was the Atkins diet at the time. And he mentioned that, and I said, well, what's that? Because I didn't know what it was. We got very little training. I'm an internal medicine trained doctor, so it's not like I'm a specialist, great, detailed micro specialist. I should know about these things, but I didn't know. And so I went to the bookstore and looked at the books that were out there, and Atkins was one of them. And he was the only one that had a clinic. All of these other diet books were written by people who weren't doctors, or if they were doctors, they were sort of like celebrities, doctors. They weren't actually clinical doctors. So I wrote Dr. Atkins a letter, and by this time I kind of forgotten about it. And he calls back and asks, yes, I got your letter. What do you want? And I said, well, this is interesting. I never got trained in what you do. Where's the research for what you do? And he kind of laughed. He laughed and said, why would I want to do research? I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what the research will find. So from his perspective, research is something that you do before you do something clinically, to test it out to see if it's safe and all that. And yet no one had done the randomized controlled trials, the due diligence of the research in this area. So one thing led to another, and he said, well, why don't you come up to my clinical practice in New York City? So I went and visited his office. Remember, he was one of the only doctors who actually had an office that you could visit. And so I actually went up and said, what do you do? Sat in the office of Dr. Atkins and Jackie Eberstein, a nurse who worked with him for 30 years. And I wasn't persuaded by one visit. I said, well, why don't you fund me to do some research? And I had a brief proposal with me, and I said, here, we'll put 50 people on your diet, however you want to do it, and we'll study it down at Duke and at the VA in Durham. And so he said, okay. And we started the first study in modern history of the low-carb Atkins diet that gave it a fair shake. By this time, we had done some research looking at what had been done before, what was the literature review, and there was very little. In fact, the one study that was the one that kind of told everyone not to do low-carb diets had 24 people in it.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't a randomized trial.
Yeah.
And it was basically done to show that it was bad. And so we were, at this time, kind of shocked that it had such a bad image. I thought for sure we would find all these studies that said it was bad, and there weren't any.
Yeah. So, Eric, the way the original study, that 24-person study, was set up, did you immediately recognize some of the limitations of that trial as you were designing? Okay. Yeah.
So I went through clinical research training and evidence-based medicine training, spent a summer month at McMaster in Ontario, and in my practice, in my general internal medicine practice at Duke, we were very well versed in how to critique clinical trials, how to actually design and run them as well. And that paper in 1980, so it was 18 years before, had 24 people in it. And actually, everyone lost weight in the study. But what was the kind of death knell or the nail in the coffin, as they say, for the low carb, high fat diet was that the LDL went up a little bit. And the triglyceride went down, and but by modern standards today, I value the triglyceride in the blood more than the LDL in the blood, but not everyone does. But so anyway, we embarked on, and Jeff Volek at about the same time. He's not an MD, but he's a PhD researcher. We both approached Dr. Atkins about the same time and started doing research, and that now is over 20 years ago, and we didn't stop with just one study. The next one we did was a randomized controlled trial. It actually was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, which is maybe second, third tier journal in internal medicine. So it's very highly regarded. And then other people started to do studies. And what was remarkable is that these other researchers, who were all very well familiar with the low-fat diet, which was the diet that everyone was doing, they never asked anyone how to do a low-carb diet. So they read the books. They didn't ever ask a doctor how to do it. And so the studies came out. They were kind of lukewarm, but they still were better than the low-fat diet. So there ended up being about 5 or 6 randomized trials of low-carb versus low-fat, and low-carb won just about every time. And the truly remarkable thing is, because these investigators wanted to show the low-carb diet was bad, they never did the second study because they didn't find what they wanted to find. They wanted to find that the low-carb diet was bad, and they didn't find it, so they didn't study it anymore. It really was remarkable in that even one of the lead authors went on to do many, many other research studies, but never really learned from someone who understood the clinical practice or even the science of low-carb keto diet. So we're in that strange position today of clinical doctors knowing a lot more and getting results that are very much further advanced than what's published in the research.
Yeah.
Because the researchers never really took the time to learn about the approach in great detail. And then our research money kind of dried up. Everyone's trying to look for the mechanism or the new drug, but we opened a clinical practice at Duke University in the private practice of the university setting, insurance pay and Medicare, Medicaid, using this approach in the year 2006. So we've been using this approach that we studied and published papers on, and still published papers on now for over 16 years.
And so you're able to use the results from your clinical practice to publish on and put that information out there then?
Currently, I don't have a big research arm of our clinical program, though, and so we summarize information best as we can. And there's a young professor now at Duke who wants to pick up the ball, if you will, and carry it downfield. And but it's very difficult to get research funding in this area, even if you were doing diet approaches that are more mainstream. It's a difficult road, and if the old publisher perish, if you don't get research money very quickly in academia, you're either finding something else to study or you're out.
Yeah, for sure. And I can imagine along the way, Dr. Atkins would have been completely unsurprised by the results of your initial trials, because of course he'd been doing it in practice for, as you say, 30 years. How were your colleagues, Eric, like as you were, embarking on this sort of new line of research? And were they convinced after you started publishing trials?
Well, some were, some weren't. So you have to understand that researchers are an interesting lot of people. Some are just always skeptical and never think there's ever an answer. Almost nihilistic. Some, even after we did the first response was, "Why are you going to visit a diet doctor who wrote books and clearly just wrote a book to get rich on?" Motivation is money, right? Well, I went and I saw the clinical practice, and no, that wasn't the real story. The real story is that Dr. Atkins had a voracious appetite and fixed himself with this dietary approach that he read about in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So he actually thought he was following published research, and then the whole field goes anti-fat, and he finds himself out on the high-fat outside the mainstream. But when I went to visit, it was clear that he didn't do this just to get rich. He did, I think, eventually get rich by most people's standards, although not compared to, CEOs or cardiothoracic surgeons, or there's a way to it's almost like there are acceptable ways to make money within the medical world, and they're non-acceptable ways. And writing diet books, at least at the time, wasn't acceptable. But he was really a doctor, and visiting the practice, I got excited to research it. And I thought, well, we'll do a few studies and it's over. I mean, we'll have fixed obesity, we'll have fixed diabetes. 20 me naively 20 years ago, because remember, 2 of my patients did this on their own without me. That's how I learned about it. Is that they did. So I thought a few studies showing that it's fine, and then everyone will be doing this, and overnight we'll have fixed all of obesity and diabetes, and that's not what happened.
No.
Of course.
No, of course. But of course, you, along with Jeff Volek and Finney, did you update the Atkins diet? Is that correct? And you've now published a much more sort of modern approach. I say modern, I don't know that that's the correct term, but you've republished it, and the information is out there in mainstream a whole lot more now than what it ever was, say, 20 years ago, which
definitely. And there actually is a meeting now in its 5th annual meeting of metabolic practices, Metabolic Health Summit, which includes a keto diet, and it's getting researched not only for obesity and diabetes, which is what we've studied, but it's being studied for many other conditions. And along the way, Steve Finney was one of my teachers. He kind of took me aside and explained how things worked mechanistically and metabolically. And Jeff Volek, we've done a few papers together, but just about all of our research has been done independently, which I think has been helpful, because if you only have one group publishing things and you don't trust that group, it's always good to have a corroborating group that gets very similar findings. And then, as an internist myself, I started using the approach for other diseases that actually Dr. Atkins had history of using it. And these are diseases that are caused or heavily influenced by insulin resistance. So I started applying the low carb, keto, high fat diets to things like polycystic ovary syndrome. And things like metabolic syndrome, which is the high triglyceride in the blood, low HDL, fatty liver, for example. Heart failure, interestingly, is caused by insulin resistance, and we can actually reverse heart failure as well. So it's been fascinating. What was once kind of vilified as something that would be bad for all these things is actually therapeutic and I think a preventative way of eating as well. And that hasn't even been started. The research using this to prevent disease hasn't even been envisioned yet. And that's where the real power is, to get people to limit their carbohydrates if they're, sensitive to them very early on, before they develop any of these problems.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. At the Metabolic Health Summit, there was I believe Don talked about the use of a ketogenic diet for COPD, which was something which I hadn't sort of thought about before. And then also I've seen you've published also on GERD, which again isn't something that people immediately think of as a treatment for some sort of like acid reflux problem.
Right. The acid reflux, or GERD, or heartburn, if you will, all refer to generally the same thing. And that is one of the strongest signals that we see clinically with very little published data. I mean, we did a study with, I think it was 5 people, and they all got better. They were pH probes placed inside the stomachs, and the acid went down. So the improvement actually occurred by changing the carbs. Didn't have anything to do with the spicy food, the coffee, the chocolate, the things that are traditionally thought of as things that cause heartburn are not relevant if you cut carbs down. So it's really the carbs that cause these GI problems like heartburn, irritable bowel syndrome, which is kind of alternating diarrhea, constipation, and crampiness in the stomach. And, of all of the fields that really should know about nutrition, you would think the gastroenterologists, these are the specialists in the stomach, in the intestines. They are specialists of internal medicine who then go into gastroenterology. They really don't know much about food. And you would think they would be the ones who would really know, right?
Yeah, completely. And did you, with regards to what's actually going on with that, Eric, what is the mechanism? Do we know what's actually going on and what's creating the different sort of environment?
Well, and that's the kicker. If you're only motivated to know the mechanism, we don't know.
Yeah.
And it may be that it's multifactorial, which makes it even harder to get a grant to study, because they're trying to get you to isolate out one factor.
Yes.
It may be that it has something to do with the gut microbiome, the fact that the carbs get digested and the bacteria multiply. They may be sending back signals that actually make the lower esophageal sphincter relax, meaning that the acidity goes up into the esophagus a little bit. And in fact, there's a discussion paragraph in our paper from a decade ago that talks about maybe it's the microbiome. Maybe the simple sugars are stopped. It may be that it's the gluten is gone. So the type of approach I use actually builds upon studies and research of different areas and it adds them all together. So what I teach is low gluten. It's a gluten-free diet. It's a FODMAP-free diet, which is the simple sugars. It's an elimination diet without a lot of the artificial additives for preservatives and artificial dyes. And if you're sensitive to those things, and it turns out, I think people who suffer from migraine headaches are particularly sensitive to an array of things, including the blood sugars going up and down and all these other additives. And there's a strong signal in the clinic, without much published data yet, about migraine headaches going away when you follow this program.
Yeah, so interesting. And I think that you raise a really important point in that so often people want to understand actually what's going on. But if you actually step back and look at the big picture of people actually getting better, then isn't that probably that's the most important sort of element? And we often try to isolate or reduce down to the one simple thing that's going to fix it, where, as you've said, it could be a multiple things. Eric, when you talk about sort of low carb nutrition helping conditions like this, what is low carb? What's your sort of definition, and what type of diet approach would you use? Because they vary depending on who you talk to.
Right. Well, we try to make things simple. And our definition of low carb, going back to the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 2007, I'm the first author of a paper of many people in this field, and something around under 150 total grams of carbs a day is called a low carb diet. And then under 50 grams of carbs, total carbs a day, is a very low carbohydrate diet, but not necessarily ketogenic. And then when you get under 20 total grams of carbs per day, that's where you are pretty sure that people are in ketosis, or meaning that it's a ketogenic low carb diet. And the protein and fat ratios and all that is less important when it comes to ketosis for obesity treatment and diabetes reversal. If you're doing this for ketone generation and trying to make sure you have ketones all day long, then you want to pay attention to the macros a little bit more detail. In our approach, we don't worry much if you're eating until you're comfortably full of meat, meaning red meat or pork, or and then chicken and fish and shellfish and eggs. If that's your source of food, your macros are going to come out right. We don't ask people to measure macros. So really, we define a low carb diet by the number of total grams of carbs for the day, not per meal, but for the total day.
And why should people focus on total carbs and not necessarily net carbohydrate amounts, in your opinion? Because I see people struggle with this a little bit too.
Yeah, so net carbs is a construct or an idea that just means more carbs. It means you're deducting the fiber and sugar alcohols that don't impact the sugar as much, or the insulin as much, as the other types of carbs. But if you're really wanting a prescription strength, something that really reverses diabetes and works for hundreds of pounds of weight loss, this is what I teach, and this is the clinic I'm in, then you want to use something that's stronger, meaning lower in carbs. Net carbs also allows the companies to get into the game, and they're making products that are higher in total carbs, but they say net carbs, and so you can be confused if you don't get the advanced training on what total carbs versus net carbs, that difference. And not that net carb counting can't work. It can work, but it's kind of like over-the-counter medicine. Over-the-counter medicines can work if you have a mild headache or mild joint pain. But if you want a prescription strength type of program, then you want to use the lower total carb, and that's going to be a stronger version of a low carb diet.
And Eric, you must have seen like thousands, or have thousands of case studies or reported back to you of people who've really succeeded with a ketogenic or a low carbohydrate approach. Yet if you look out there on the best and worst diet report that comes out every year, is it US Weekly? I don't know, something like that. And then also in the literature, they talk about that, it's difficult to adhere to a ketogenic diet. And that's often the message that is sort of placed, that keto might be fine, but it's so difficult. People just can't adhere to it. Like, do you have anything that you respond to when you hear that criticism?
Well, there are a couple things you mentioned. The ability to stick to something is an individual thing, and my approach is to keep things as simple as possible. You want to make a program that is easy so that when life gets difficult, you don't just throw it out the window. So we have a simple method of teaching it, and there's some people that would rather just suffer the consequences of eating fruit all day long than to cut out eating fruit. But then there are also people who are addicted to eating fruit and can't come to grips with that. So they're really not in control of what they're doing, but they think they are. Anyway, the other thing about other expert recommendations is we're at that point where you ask a panel of judges who are not familiar with keto diets, they're going to say don't do them. So what's happening there, it'd be like asking the Olympic Committee, if all the judges were from New Zealand, who wins the Olympic figure skating? Well, the New Zealander, of course.
Yeah. No,
or the American, after all your judges. So, but what's changing, and this year, several keto-friendly doctors have been asked to be on some of the panels, or at least one of them, to be kind of on the jury, being judges. And so I think you'll see that the keto diet is more favorably regarded by this new panel of judges who are less biased in one direction.
That's brilliant, because if I see another diet countdown or a list that has like Weight Watchers, the Dash, and these other and other really random ones up above something which I find so helpful in clinic, it's just mind-boggling. Yeah. Eric, I do remember you it might have been on a podcast, you had such a good explanation for why in the literature we may see differences when we look at weight loss and the low fat versus a low carbohydrate approach. Right at the sort of conclusion of the diet, yet 6 months on, there doesn't appear to be that much difference. And you talk about how, doctors aren't health coaches.
Yeah, well, so there's several reasons. When we were starting our research over 20 years ago, we went and visited Dr. Atkins. We went to visit Dr. Rosedale. I went to visit Dr. Bernstein, who uses low carb for type 1 diabetes. And so we learned a method that had been used over and over and over in clinical practice and brought it back to the research table. And we knew that the 20 total grams was going to be more effective. So if you look at all of the studies that were done, we used the lowest 20 total grams, and then we kept people at the 20 grams all the way through to the end of the study. When you look at the other researchers, they read the books, and the book said go to 20 grams for 2 weeks and add back carbs. And then, so what they did is they basically added back carbs too soon from what the clinical doctors did, because they didn't visit the clinical doctors. So what we came up with in the research looking back is that there were a few papers that really kept people on the high dose, high strength for 6 months or a year, but most of the studies were basically letting people eat carbs, and even one very recently let people go up to as many carbs as they wanted within the 6-month period, even though they were still, quote, on a low carb diet. So what I've learned in clinical practice, and I'm past president of the largest group of obesity medicine doctors in the world, I've taught this at medical meetings to other doctors, is that you keep people on that prescription strength low carb diet under medical supervision as long as they need it, and until people reach their goal. And I say medical supervision because most people come to me on medicines now, and I get to take people off the medicine. And sometimes if they're not aware that the medicine can cause side effects, they think it's the diet that's causing the side effect, like feeling weak or dizzy, when really it was the blood pressure medicine becoming too strong. So I always, in a clinical setting, I'll always have that caveat or the warning that, you want to be followed by a doctor. It's prescription strength, what I use. Now, if you don't have any health problems, and I think this is healthy eating for anyone. You don't ever really have to eat carbs. And, just as a point of science, I had to convince myself scientifically and medically that it would be safe to feed people without carbohydrate. And it turns out that it's very strong in the scientific literature that humans do not have to eat carbohydrate. They want to or like to is a different issue. But even there are these reality shows where people go for 1 or 2 months without eating hardly anything. And these people are in massive ketosis, even though they may not measure it, but you can see they're not eating carbs. I mean, in many cases, they're not eating anything. And then, so that's the other kind of hit me in the head kind of moment was when we don't eat anything, we default to a fat metabolism with nutritional ketosis.
Yeah.
That's our default kind of fuel system and source. We store fat as energy. We draw upon the fat and make ketones. And so how is that bad? It's like our natural fail-safe system. How could that be bad? Well, it could be, and that's why we do research and follow people. But it makes me less worried than telling someone they can eat all the sugar they want, which has been totally unstudied in a way that really puts the sugar on the on the hot seat.
Yeah.
There haven't been good studies, and finally, the Stanton Glands at the University of San Francisco unearthed some of the whistleblowing papers that basically sugar paid off the researchers to study fat and not sugar, the sugar industry, basically, and employ kind of like the tobacco industry to distract the other researchers. So I can't show you a paper that says sugar is the cause of diabetes, but I can show you that by taking away all the carbs, I can reverse diabetes. So it's very likely it's one of the culprits.
Yeah. And people are super uncomfortable with that notion. And it's like a few minutes ago, you mentioned that people could be addicted to fruit, for example. And, we are continually told that, one of the most strongest public health messages, at least here in New Zealand, is to eat your 5+ a day, and fruit is not an issue. And of course, if you are metabolically healthy, then fruit is not an issue. However, in the US, we don't have stats like this in New Zealand because they don't put money into investigating this. But as I understand it, 93% of the US are now sort of deemed metabolically unhealthy. So to say that fruit is quote unquote healthy is almost, that's a very unhelpful message from most of the population.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the confusion arises from there are some people that can eat fruit and do fine.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's the context, it's the selection bias of the people. And from the clinical perspective of a doctor like me, it's carbs are the problem. You cut back carbs, it can actually be really easy to get rid of cravings and hunger. But you have to be very strict about eliminating all of them. And I wanted to just look back to that's probably the most common reason people find this difficult is that they don't go all in. They're not really, really super strict. So it'd be kind of like trying to quit smoking when you had a cigarette or two every day. It's really hard. In fact, it won't work for most people. Yeah.
And in your experience, because I actually did want to ask you about that, is that you do need to have a set period of time without the carbohydrate to almost break that cycle of is addiction the right word to use? Dependence, or, what is it that, but you do need that sort of period of time. Like 3 weeks isn't enough.
Well, I think there is a sugar addiction. I think there is, you don't have to eat sugar. And, some people say, oh, it's not addiction because it's food. But the degree to which it affects people varies. So there's a spectrum and some people are not pulled towards sugar at all and can stop at one candy bar. Others can't stop. So there are a couple, one textbook on food addiction, processed food addiction, and then a very interesting book and podcast called Food Junkies, which takes the theme and of addiction for food and sugar and applies behavioral methods to helping people deal with that sugar addiction. But to become a fat burner, to get into ketosis, yes, you have to be very, very strict. And there was only one study with a gradual reduction of the carbs, and it wasn't compared to the total cessation of carbs. The method I was taught was the total cessation. And in some people, it might make sense to taper the carbs, others to go full, like a cold turkey sort of quit smoking day, a quit carb day. I haven't seen that studied head to head, but the approach I use is more the addiction, quit smoking, go over through a withdrawal syndrome, and it's actually not as bad. The fear of cutting out the fruit is worse than the actual cutting out of the fruit. And people will come back to me with the metaphor of the tail between the legs, sort of embarrassed that they were so worried about it, and then it was just so easy. Of course, I have a very short memory for that sort of thing, because some people, my fruit, my bread, how will I be able to do this? And then they're just fine.
Yeah. And Eric, in your clinical experience, is it necessary for most people, if they have a health condition which requires low carbohydrate, do they need to stay as low as what you initially prescribed? And obviously we talked about a length of time with which they stay low, but what is the trajectory for most people, if there is such a if you can generalize?
Yeah, well, so it depends the severity of the metabolic problems that people have. If you're you only have 20 pounds to lose and you're just doing it for weight loss, you're probably going to be able to get to your goal in a couple months, 3 months, and then you can gradually add back carbs. Of course, if you add back carbs to the degree that you were eating before and you can't control it, you're just going to regain the weight. And that is the kind of funny thing that people say is, I did that low carb diet and then I gained all the weight back. And then I'll say, well, but stop doing it, right? Well, yes, people don't blame a pill for not working if you don't take the pill, but people will blame a diet for not working because they can't stay on it, right? But today, in 2022, the resources online and at the grocery stores and the it's just so supportive now in many places of doing a diet like this. It's never been easier that I've seen to do a low carb diet. But you don't have to stay super strict all your life. It's not like we're going to lock you up in a prison. All you can eat is low carb foods, and then we start drawing upon your money out of the bank account. It's not like a cult.
Yeah.
A method to get you to a goal, and then you can do whatever you want.
Yeah. And Eric, in your experience now, 20 years on or even 30 years on, if I'm thinking about the timeline, how open are doctors to the idea of a low carb approach for their patients?
Yeah, I've never seen a formal survey of that. That would be a great thing to do. Informally, there are many, many keto-friendly doctors now. We call that a term, keto-friendly. And there are many who are not keto-friendly. But I think the persuasion, a lot of doctors come to this because, like Dr. Atkins, they solved their own metabolic problem by doing a low-carb keto diet. So I'm watching new doctors come to this, having found it themselves, and then start using it for their patients. I think this last kind of sticking point is the time-honored story we've all been told that cholesterol is bad and fat in the food leads to cholesterol and that causes hardening of the arteries. And that's kind of like the last prejudging, the last prejudice of the low-carb diet that needs to fall. And it's going to be a tough battle to even when we show data of people with extremely high LDL levels doing fine for years, it gets dismissed as well, and then we're in this particular instance, we're battling the drug company treatment of cholesterol, which is a very lucrative field to be in, and they can market their drugs. And all we say is, this is a lifestyle change, and actually lifestyle change is on these guidelines for cholesterol treatment. It's just a lot of doctors don't think their patients will do it or will change. But the idea that you have to have carbs, I think, has been dispelled. I think most doctors know that, and a growing number are more familiar and even advise it. But I don't know the exact percentage. I think it's probably still pretty low. Of course, Remember, doctors in general get very little training in nutrition, which means it's hard to then teach based on a foundation of knowledge. So, if we knew that doctors have been taught that there's no essential carbohydrate, you don't have to eat carbs, you need amino acids, you need fats, you build a sound nutritional program by starting with fatty acids and amino acids, and carbs are fine if you can tolerate them. That would be the proper teaching, that then it would make more sense to doctors and nutrition and dietitians. But since they really had no foundational science or biology, they're just kind of flapping in the breeze of, the Mediterranean diet. It's great.
Oh, yeah.
What does that mean?
Totally. And it's interesting, Eric, because I have done a bit of teaching, and I stand there and I talk to them the way that you're just talking, about the actual fundamentals of diet. Yet when I get the assignments back, because they have other resources that they go to, it always comes back to carbs are king. So it's that real message is like, it's a little bit like smoking, isn't it? It's going to take several decades, I think, to sort of unravel what's gone on before. And you raise an interesting point that doctors know what they know and what they've been taught. And with regards to cholesterol, they're taught to focus on LDL, whereas as you mentioned earlier, the triglycerides is potentially a much more helpful marker with regards to overall disease risk. Yeah,
and the idea that LDL cholesterol is good for you fighting infection. I mean, so someone needs to be out there supporting LDL. Being the detail marketing person to show how great LDL is, because it's actually doing all these wonderful transporting the fat soluble vitamins, and it's helping to sequester bacteria. And yet most medically trained people and dietitians, even cholesterol, LDL, that's what causes heart disease. As if God or evolution put it in there just to cause heart disease.
I know.
No, it has all of these other functions that, honestly, I wasn't taught. I had to go relearn myself and actually write a class about it to kind of have the discipline to really, put my name on something and to feel comfortable and actually to block the cholesterol production in the body is fraught with a lot of theoretical and practical problems because we need cholesterol so much.
No, completely. And, Eric, I've seen your name on papers around the energy balance model of obesity versus the carbohydrate and insulin model of obesity. And most recently, it seemed like a convergence of all of the authors on a paper that sort of described where the commonalities lie. Are you able to, for us, to sort of briefly describe the differences? Is it actually academic? It probably isn't. It's obviously more than that. But is it important to really understand fundamentally, yes, it's the energy balance, yes, it's carbohydrate or insulin? What is the state of that sort of science?
Yeah, so what we noticed, there's a Harvard professor, that's David Ludwig, who is a great conciliator, a compromiser. And so his idea was to bring in the camps of the calories in, calories out. We know what causes obesity. And then the clinical obvious reduction of carbohydrates leads to reduction of obesity. But at the end of the day, I think both are right. And, like most things, there are shades of gray and nuances. I mean, so if you go onto a reality show and you don't eat anything, it's no calories at all, you're going to lose weight to drop on your fat store. But it's also zero carbs, right? So is it zero carb or is it zero calorie? It really doesn't matter. So the people who are grandstanding about calories, it's just calories, we know the result. It was actually Gary Taubes, an investigative journalist, who said something that really hit home to me. He talked about the situation of asking a friend, why is that restaurant crowded? And the friend says, well, more people went in than came out. And you look at your friend and you go, no, 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 no. I know of that.
Yeah,
More
yeah.
people, but why crowded? Well, more people went in than came out, and you keep going like, well, but is it good food? Is it the service? Is it good drinks? Is it a handsome staff? And no, it's crowded because more people went in than came out. And then I went to my next meeting when someone went up there and said it's calories in, calories out, and it just opened, my eyes were open, the scales fell, because they were saying what's called a tautology, meaning, of course it's true that when you gain weight, more calories have gone in than come out. It doesn't tell you why. So actually in this paper that David Ludwig was first author on and got us to help and sign on to, he talks about the tautology of energy balance, meaning this is really, he didn't say it in an academic journal saying that this is kind of ridiculous, guys. You're really just saying the truth that there's more calories that go in than out when you're gaining weight. It doesn't tell you why. So the hormonal energy, the conflict to me is sort of over dramatized, bully pulpit kind of things, and the practical realities both matter. And there comes a time when I restrict carbs that just saying low carbs isn't enough, and I focus on the calorie side, the habit eating, the going out for restaurant food that you're given twice as much, and you're eating past your feeling of fullness. I mean, so academically, I think it's important to kind of get a sense that there are studies that can be done hypothesis-wise around both of these ideas. And that was, I think, Dr. Ludwig's idea, is that it's not that one is right or wrong, but these are worth testing, and hypotheses can be, or studies can be created testing these different hypotheses to be a new round of research funding, and not just dismisses about the idea that, well, more people went in the restaurant than came out. Duh.
Yeah. No, totally. And I noted that an area of agreement, if you like, was the fact that there's a lot of ultra processed food out there that is largely responsible for both increasing the calories that people eat, but also driving up the amount of carbohydrate that people eat as well. So yeah, I understand.
Well, in the U.S., the problem is a matter of too many calories and too many carbs. And you can do low-calorie diets, and they can work, but most people get hungry and then bail out, because if you're fighting hunger all day long, food is everywhere, so you're going to break down and you're going to break that calorie limit. The beauty of a low-carb diet and one of the hormonal things that change, the insulin goes down so much that the hunger goes away, and the difference of a dietary approach, low carb versus low fat, is for most people low carb leaves you with less hunger or no hunger at all, and the low carb calorie restriction approach generally leaves people hungry. And although there are individual variations on that, it's almost as strong as me putting someone on a pill to cut the hunger out. The effect of a low carb diet is as strong for hunger and appetite reduction as medication is, and yet you don't need the medicine.
Yeah, which is amazing. And Eric, I know that you've got on your website, a range of resources, and one of them was around, where people go wrong with the ketogenic diet. And you mentioned that a lot of people go to a keto diet and think that they can eat all of the dietary fat that they like now. So what is sort of your response to that approach to a keto diet if someone's in it for, say, weight loss or whatever?
Yeah, well, again, that's where the blending of the energy balance and the hormonal response, calorie or carbohydrate insulin model really blend together, because the approach that I learned had a limit on cheese, cream, mayonnaise, butter, because what I learned came out of a clinical practice. And now if someone just goes to the internet and learns about keto, you might learn that if it has no carbs in it, you can have as much as you want. But practically speaking, you're going to burn the fat and the cheese and the mayonnaise that you eat before your body's going to burn up its own body fat and let go its body store. So if you're trying to reverse diabetes or lose fat off your body, it makes no sense to add in unlimited amounts of fats. And so we have a strict limit on that. And I mean, the other kind of major things that came out that we never studied was the idea of putting medium chain triglyceride in the coffee with butter and blending it up, and no question, it can give you ketones, and in fact, might give you a little buzz, and you feel more focused and all that, but it's got a lot of calories. And so I started asking, well, how many bulletproof coffees or this kind of concoction have you had? And some people would have 3 or 4 or 5 a day. And this is just, you're not going to burn your body fat if you're drinking 1,500 calories of fats. And so there's the carb restriction for just about everyone limits the caloric intake automatically, but not everyone.
Yeah.
And so for those who it's not automatically reducing your calorie and energy intake, the amount of food you eat, then you may need some advanced coaching to help you realize you don't have to eat 3 meals a day. That's a common meme or, common wives' tale here, that you have to eat. It'd be like going to fill up your car 3 times a day when you're just driving around town, because you already have a gas tank that's full. Your fat gas tank is super full. You want to draw up on it. You don't need to eat so much. But the other kinds of things people make mistakes on, the largest one, I think, is the excessive cheese and the high calorie items, but then there's the kind of internet overcomplication of what to do. Some people come in thinking they have to be checking their ketone level, or they have to be using an app and calculate their macros, and it has to be corrected every meal. And some of these macros can be very directive about what you should do, And so we teach a method that's very uncomplicated. You don't have to use apps. And in fact, our method goes back to the 1860s when, they didn't have computers. It's really the Banting diet was the approach that we teach.
Yeah. So it's more food on a plate and what that plate should look like. Yeah. Eric, what about alcohol for people who are doing keto or low carb? What's the general recommendation around that?
Well, if you're trying to maximize weight loss, alcohol has calories, and so you want to restrict your drinking of calories. But most people can drink 1 drink a day, meaning a light beer, 3 or 4 inches of dry wine, 1 or 2 alcoholic shots with a sugar-free mixer, one of those a day, and do fine, because your body has to burn through the alcohol, the calories of the alcohol, then the calories of the carbs, before it's going to give up the calories off the fat store off its body. So there's a lot of individual variability, but it's not forbidden to have alcohol. You have to have some moderation or none during the week and just drink on the weekends or something. So there's a lot of ways to be able to address alcohol.
Yeah. And I mean, I think as you rightly pointed out earlier, a lot of it is habit with what we do around food and reestablishing better boundaries, I suppose, or habits around things which might tip the balance if we had no sort of restrictions on them, I suppose.
Yeah.
Eric, do you see any differences between men and women in your clinic?
Well, this is a great, another thing that's not been studied, but the clinical signal is very strong that women lose slower than men. So men in terms of how much weight. Even when you adjust for how large people are, and then of course postmenopausal women have we all tend to develop insulin resistance as we get older, and then the menopause brings in another factor, so that women have to be super strict about carbs, generally speaking, around the menopause as well. But when husband and wife do the program together, there's usually this initial sort of why is it so hard for me and not for him, and but over time, kind of like the tortoise and the hare fable, you stick with it. Your husband might fall off and you're actually going to be winning in the end. But I mean, at the end of the day, we try to make people be happy together about their results. But I think nobody really knows why, but it's probably going to be related to the hormonal effects of menstruation.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose the message that I got from that was that patience is a virtue, and just stick at it. Is that sort of the major strategy that helps overcome?
Today immediate gratification isn't fast enough for most of my patients. And, and to put it into context so that you might read online or that some great results, but when I have people being successful, on average, it's 1 to 2 pounds of weight loss per week.
Yeah.
So that's 4 to 8 pounds per month. And if you're in that range, it might seem slow, and compared to the person who lost 50 pounds in the month online, those are the outliers, right? It's the high school, the school reunion effect. The people who are doing great come back to the reunions, and people post online. It's like the highlight reel, when in the clinical setting, 1 to 2 pounds per week, no pills, no products, and you're eating tasty food that's sustainable. That's really, really good.
Yeah. And Eric, your own approach to nutrition, low carb, keto?
Oh, yeah. Well, so when we did our first studies going back to 1998, I felt like I had to walk the talk. I wanted to learn how to be a teacher of the low carb diet. So I learned about it myself, started it. I wanted to know where you would go in the local grocery stores, what to purchase, because there's an art to that you want to, some people will ask you what to find or what at this grocery store, what is available. And I don't fall into that. I teach based on the total grams of carbs, and I teach looking at the labels very heavily, but I stick to zero or very low carb foods for the most part. Don't do any counting personally. I rarely have breakfast, maybe a brunch on a weekend, but then I've been doing it 20 years. It took me 10 years to give up sugar jelly beans on Easter. Well, and I grew up with Halloween, where we had mounds of candy every year, and we eat for months. I have I have so many cavities that I don't. The inside of my teeth are gone. If you got the cavities, I have these little stubs going around. That's not normal. And the other vestiges of growing up in the U.S. in the 60s is, I have hearing loss because of all the ear infections because my parents smoked,
Crazy,
because
yes.
it created nasal congestion and all this. And so I'm carrying a lot of the old sugar damage, but I haven't had carbs really to speak of for over 20 years.
Yeah. And I understand. And of course, as you said, it's so much easier now to follow a sort of a low carb / keto approach. Interestingly, I was just in the UK and different to the US and in New Zealand, where keto is a thing. I saw it once. One product was keto in about 15 different supermarkets, which I ventured into. So it feels like there is a real opportunity there for, I don't know, like something to happen. I know it's a thing over there as well, but it just seems so much more available and out there in the US and in New Zealand, actually.
Well, if someone's coming to me to do the prescription strength or they've tried over-the-counter keto, meaning internet keto, I'll be pretty blunt and I'll say, if it says keto on it, don't have it.
Yeah.
The marketing of products is not well governed. There's no regulatory approach and or standards. And while keto generally means it's lower in carbs. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to be ketogenic. And it's important to remember that keto really means you're burning body fat. There is really no, quote, keto food. It's either a protein or a fat or a carb. And when someone's adding oils to something or medium chain triglyceride, that doesn't mean you're going to be in ketosis without regard to what else you do during the day. So we're in that kind of awkward moment where some of the products are not helping my patients, but there are enough people that maybe that don't need to be so strict that it's going to be helpful for, because it doesn't fear the fat, it limits the sugars, which is a great direction to go in, I think.
Yeah, awesome. And do you think, just finally, like if you think about what Dr. Atkins how he might view sort of the state of the research now, but also the potential popularity of low carb, how do you think he might view that? Do you think he would be pleased with how things are going? Do you think he would dispirit all of the keto products? Like, I don't know, just interested to hear from someone who knew him.
Well, that would be a great question for Jackie Eberstein, who is still around. She's the nurse who works with Dr. Atkins for 30 years. And I didn't get to know Dr. Atkins very well. And by the time I was ready to kind of go back to say, hey, teach me what you know, he had fallen on the ice in New York City, bumped his head, and he passed away in an untimely death, I think in his early 70s. And so I do remember Jackie saying a story that Dr. Atkins said to Jackie, I'm not going to see this through to become widespread, but you will, he said. He said, you'll see this grow, and it is growing. I'd have to think, it is. I got to know him enough and got to see enough of his patients that he was a charismatic doctor who cared about his patients, and his patients loved him. And so I think he would like the idea that more and more people were benefiting from it. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's, I can only imagine. And I think that for as much as, I guess, the critiques that around the ketogenic diet or low carb, just as a sort of an approach, there is more and more is still continuing to grow interest in a range of areas. And I think that the papers you're publishing on with regards to the GERD, with the type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, obviously, and obesity, in addition to all of the other sort of clinics and clinicians and researchers, I think this is really promising. That's what I'll say. It's promising.
Yeah, well, so the advent of the internet has been essential, and to allow people to see the results that other people are getting. And having done some reading on paradigms and paradigm shifts, the paradigm will flip when the new way of doing things can do things the old way can't. So we can reverse diabetes.
Yes.
We can reverse heart failure. We can do all these things that the old paradigm can't do. And the low-fat diet came out about the time everyone was using phones with cords on them.
Yeah.
The fact that to think that technology for phones has advanced so much, and yet you can't advance the technology of diet.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just kind of silly.
Yeah.
So we can accomplish so much more with a low-carb keto approach than those other folks can. It's now just getting the message out, spreading the word, and things will change.
Yeah, and you do an amazing job of that, Eric, with your website, where you have free resources, you have online courses, you've got your End the Carb Confusion, your book, the cookbook. You and your team, including Amy, do an amazing job of putting that information out there. Where can people find you if they've yet to discover any of this?
Yeah, so ericwestmanmd.com. That's ERIC, Eric Westman, MD.com, has a link to all of the latest things that I'm doing,
awesome.
Which could be as simple as a sheet of paper with the list of foods, or a course or a book. So it really depends how you like to learn. And so we have many different resources available depending on your learning style. And you don't have to make the trip to Durham, North Carolina, Duke University. We want to affect as many people as possible with this kind of teaching material.
Yeah, that is awesome. Thank you, Eric. And there is a number of excellent talks that you've given over the years at Metabolic Health Summit and other conferences as well, which you can truly learn a lot from. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Alrighty, what a wealth of information. Loved that conversation and was super privileged to hear Eric talk at the Metabolic Health Summit and meet him in person. Next week, I sit down and chat to Jeff Peltier, who is a ultra runner, a video producer, and has a very prolific YouTube channel all about his running adventures. And we sit and chat about the creation of these and how he's integrated his love of running with his professional career. And if you don't follow Jeff, he is so inspirational and puts together some really brilliant content. So we chat next week. Until then though, peeps, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or head on over to MikkiWilliden.com, sign up to one of my online nutrition coaching programs, recipe portal access, or book a one-on-one consult with me. Thanks so much for being here and catch you next week. See you later.